Now we should be live.
Let me see. Cool. Yeah, looks good.
Can you check the audio as well?
Sounds good. Am I good to start?
Yeah, let me just wait, Peter, by the way, you're muted.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you just check that the audio is fine? Like through the YouTube live.
Let me see. It's good.
Okay, thanks.
I was trying to get in and I couldn't get in, so I entered through the other like our common group email. But then I thought, okay, you guys are setting up, so I just let you set up.
I'm so sorry about that. Yeah, I think you accidentally kicked us
Yeah, no
all
worries.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Let's retry. Let's retry. This is the first time it happens.
No worries.
Let's retry it. So yeah, can you try sharing your screen again?
But it's good we haven't
I
started
thought
yet.
I accidentally clicked something wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Can you guys see my screen now?
Awesome. Yeah. Okay, cool. Maybe let's get started. So
sounds
yeah,
good.
thank you everyone for joining us. I know particularly speaking, and most people are in ICU right now, so really appreciate you guys being here right now. So today we have Naveen, Raman, who I've had the pleasure to work with, and I'm really happy to have here today, talking about selecting decision relevant concepts in reinforcement learning. So yeah, please Raman, please Naveen, take it away.
That sounds good. Thanks for the introduction. And so yeah, today I'll be talking about some of our work looking at how we can best sort of structure explanations in the sort of paradigm of concept-based learning. And this is done in collaboration between my advisor, Fei Fang at Carnegie Mellon, and Stephanie Milani, who's at NYU. And so to begin with, I'll do like a quick kind of recap on concept-based learning and interpretability in general, which might be sort of familiar for people in this audience. And so to begin with, a lot of the machine learning models we deal with in this day and age are black boxes. And so you can imagine lots of different examples where we can't really understand why certain predictions are made, or we can't peer underneath the hood of the model itself. The sort of canonical example that we see in our everyday lives is language models, where we don't have a sense for, or we may not have an amazing sense for why certain predictions are made, just because of the fact that these models are very large and inherently kind of hard to understand. But this is seen in other domains of our everyday lives as well. For example, autonomous vehicles such as Waymo, which are getting ever more popular, are also kind of a combination of control theory, computer vision, and other things. And understanding, for example, why a vehicle made a turn in this direction or that direction is something that we don't necessarily have insight into. And just understanding underneath all the complexity of these algorithms, why things occur, is quite difficult. And the third example is what's known as recidivism rulings. And so in some areas, a lot of decisions related to bail and how long someone should be arrested for and detained for and things like that are partially decided through an algorithm. And understanding the sort of biases of this algorithm, why this algorithm makes certain decisions, can be a black box. And this can have enormous consequences of fairness, justice, and things like that. And so we really want these algorithms to be understandable. There's lots of scenarios where we can imagine where we want to understand, for example, why certain biases exist or whether certain biases exist, and trying to audit for those type of biases, where we would want more than black box access, where we would want to understand, hey, is this model interpretable? Is this model understandable? And you can imagine sort of in maybe more modern terms, we could see, oh, are these chatbots saying or being uncertain in ways they shouldn't be? For example, are they being overconfident? Why are they being overconfident? Are these sort of models hallucinating? Understanding all these sort of issues for these models is a challenge because of the fact that these models are black boxes, because we can't really understand what goes on underneath the hood. The solution to all this, or one particular solution, is interpretability. And so the loose idea behind interpretability is that we want to be able to understand, or in particular, humans should be able to understand why certain decisions are made or the kind of causation behind that decision. And so an example of this is you can imagine instead of these sort of deep neural networks or these sort of black box models, we could have something like a decision tree. And so you could look at the decision that's being made in this tree and you can backtrack and see, oh, this is the reason that a particular decision was made. This is the kind of features that led to this decision. And if I change this particular feature, if I perturb this particular thing, I could change my output in a very clear way. And so you can imagine that these sort of simple decision trees are one end of the spectrum in terms of interpretability, where we could relatively easily understand this. And on the other end are some of the examples that we brought up before, which are much harder to understand. Another example within the sort of interpretability paradigm, which I'll be talking about a lot today, is known as concept-based interpretability. And the key idea behind that is it combines two types of predictors. The first is a concept predictor. And so we start from some kind of high dimensional representation. For example, you can imagine that we have some kind of image, say of a bird, and we want to take this image and turn it into a set of human understandable concepts. And so in this case, for example, you could say things that as a human, I might look at the bird and say these are properties of are its wing color, its tail color, its beak length, things like that. And so I could first have a concept predictor, maybe some kind of deep neural network that I can't understand that predicts these human understandable concepts. From there, I could have a task predictor that maps these sort of human understandable concepts to maybe the bird species or something like that. And this task predictor itself can be something interpretable, maybe a decision tree, maybe a shallow neural network or something like that. And the nice thing here is you can perturb some of these human understandable concepts to see why a particular prediction was made. You can better understand how the concept C relate to the task Y in this case. And so a lot of the kind of non-interpretability in this kind of model is shoved or put into the concept predictor in the first part, this sort of CNN. And so the kind of second part, the task predictor, is much more understandable. And this is a very useful thing in real world. And so I'll give a simple example of where these sort of concept-based models have actually been used in reality and the sort of benefits they provide. And so one example is a study from a couple of years back looking at using these sort of concept-based models or a variant of that for self-driving cars. The key idea is that when someone is driving a car, when somebody's inside the kind of self-driving car, they'll see the planned trajectory, they'll see why a certain decision was made. And so in this case, you'll see why, for example, a car will stop or go fast based on what kind of concept it sees. It might see, for example, a stop sign up ahead, it might see a pedestrian up ahead, things like that. And one of the things that the study found is that people have better kind of mental models of how the car operates, just because of the fact that it's interpretable. So people really have a better understanding of why maybe the car makes a certain decision, or why maybe a robot makes a certain decision, which helps them better conceptualize everything. And so concept-based models bring these kind of advantages that this sort of interpretability allows us to better understand these models, but at the same time, it's challenging to design the model itself. Typically, when we want to design the model, we might start from some kind of baseline policy, something maybe non-interpretable or just some kind of policy to kind of get us started. And then from there, we need to select a set of concepts. For example, from before, we had this sort of bird classification test, and you can imagine there's a bunch of different properties of birds that matter. You can imagine the wing color, the wing size, the background, the size of the bird, things like that are all important. And then from there, we train a concept-based policy. Afterwards, we might teach performance. We might see, hey, we do really poorly at predicting birds that have this particular tail length and things like that. And we might add new features or new concept onto this and kind of go in the cycle of, hey, we have a kind of a bank of concepts. Maybe I'll add our new concepts. And the key kind of question we want to ask is, how do we best design these sort of models? And in particular, how do we think about the way that we should select the kind of concepts that are most relevant for decision-making? And in particular, we're working in this sort of reinforcement learning decision-making setting. A natural question someone might have is, why do the kind of set of concepts I select actually matter? And so I'll give a simple example to explain why these sort of concepts actually matter and how they impact the way that we actually make decisions in practice. And so we'll start with a simple example. We can imagine here that we have some kind of state. In this case, it's some kind of game. You can imagine that you, the player, are some kind of triangle. You need to obtain the key in the top right, and then open the door in the bottom left, or kind of middle left, or middle down, and go out through that. And so from this state, you can imagine maybe the state is some kind of image representation of this game. You'll get a set of concepts, and from that concept, you'll get a policy that tells you, hey, in this case, I should turn right. And so depending on how useful the concepts are, I could have different types of actions that I take. And so for the time being, let's assume that I have a bunch of different concepts that I could potentially have. For example, one concept could be, is my door open? Is the background tile gray? Is the door brown? Do I have the key? Things like that. And so I'll make an action based on my prediction for these different concepts. And so I'll give kind of two extreme examples of different kind of concepts that I could select and how that impacts the decisions I make. On one hand, I could imagine that I start from two concepts. The two concepts I have are, is the tile gray and is the door brown? And in this case, these two states on the left and the right have the same value for both of those concepts. So for example, in both cases, the tiles are both gray, the door is both brown or red or whatever color that is. But you could see that the kind of policy or the action we take are wildly different. So for example, on the left state, I want to turn left, go get the key, and then go to the door. Whereas in the right state, the best thing I should do is go forward. And so because of the fact that both of these kind of states look indistinguishable from the perspective of the concepts, but lead to different actions, you can imagine that we get poor performance because of the fact that these two concepts we select aren't really capturing the full kind of complexity of the state itself. On the flip side, you can imagine that we get better performance if we get concepts that are more relevant to decision making. And so, for example, here, my set of concepts that I select here are, hey, I want to see where my key is, which differs between the two states, and also whether my door is open, whether the door is open or not. And so with this, you can develop policies that map different kind of combinations of these to different actions. And here, these two states have different sort of concept representations, which could potentially lead to policies being able to distinguish them and kind of give different actions in this case. And so kind of the key intuition or the key kind of idea we want to look at here is to see how do we determine which concepts are the most relevant for decision making. If we can select those kind of concepts, we can hopefully train a better concept model in a more kind of efficient way. And we want to think about how do we do this in a principled manner. And so to better understand this, I'm going to take a quick detour into reinforcement learning. And in particular, I'm going to take a detour into something known as state abstractions that'll help us define rigorously what we mean by decision relevancy. And so in state abstraction, I'll start with the kind of quick analogy. You can imagine that in a lot of decision-making tasks, we start out with a very complex state where we need to move around, decide things, but not everything in that state is relevant. As an example, let's suppose that we're in some kind of forest and need to navigate to find the exit or find our way to some campgrounds. In this case, the forest has lots of complexities. You can imagine that my kind of mental model of a forest is there's a lot of trees, there's a lot of there's a river, there's a bridge, but maybe the details of everything doesn't matter. For example, it doesn't matter where exactly each individual tree is as much as maybe the general kind of makeup of the forest. And so I can distill this sort of complex state into something that we'll call an abstract state, something much simpler. Here, rather than the details of where every single individual tree is or exactly how the river meanders, I can just kind of distill this down and say, there's some kind of forest covering on the left side, some kind of forest covering on the right side. There's some bridge in the middle that I'm near, and I need to cross that bridge. And the main thing is that I want to get rid of all of the kind of unimportant details of the state that aren't relevant to my action. Here, if I'm in this kind of abstract state, I know what kind of action to take, and it's a much simpler thing to reason over versus the much more complex state is much harder. And to kind of illustrate this further, you can imagine that if I'm in a really complex state, there's many, many different kind of transitions between different states. There's many different kind of states that are similar, but I might take similar actions in, and it just makes the entire problem much harder. In sort of more rigorous terms, you can imagine that in a more complex state space, I need many more samples or a much more complex policy to learn the optimal actions. Whereas if I can distill this down to a much simpler state space, I can reason in a much simpler manner. I need much fewer samples, and it just kind of helps overall. And so a natural question is, okay, this seems like a nice thing if we can distill this complex state space down to an abstract state space, but when can we actually do this? When can we actually kind of take the complexity out, deal with a simpler state space, and do our decisions or make our decisions in this state space? And so the way to think about this is we can think about this formally through a little bit of reinforcement learning sort of terminology. And so I'll introduce a bit of RL terminology, and I'll kind of explain theoretically why this is important. If this is kind of all new to you or very confusing, it's not super important. This is more just grounding for the theory itself to explain why we decide what decision relevant means. And so to begin with, suppose that we're in some kind of RL environment. Here you can imagine that I have a state, an action, a discount factor, a reward, and a transition. And so I'll introduce two functions. The first is a Q function. Here we'll denote a Q pi of S and A, where pi is the policy. And what that intuitively says is, if I'm at state S and I take action A, following the policy pi from here on out, what is my kind of expected reward that I get? And it's kind of this kind of expected discounted reward. And the other kind of important function we'll look at is the value function, which is a sort of simplification of the Q function, which says, if I'm only in a state S and I kind of follow the policy pi throughout from here on out, what is expected reward I get? And you could think of the V function as basically being the Q function where the action is taken through the policy pi initially. And so from this, we can train different kind of policies. And you can also think about maybe I have an optimum policy that optimizes the kind of Q function everywhere, or the kind of sum of the Q function or any kind of function like that. And I also have maybe some kind of abstracted policy. Here, the optimal policy might operate on the raw kind of complex state space from before. And the abstracted policy might operate on the simpler state space that's much kind of more abstracted away. And so the kind of natural question that I want to ask is, okay, what is the relationship? When can I abstract away my state space, but make sure that my abstract policy and my optimal policy essentially perform the same or are very similar? To do this, we'll give some kind of theory to give some intuition how this works. And there's a nice sort of theoretical bound from prior work a few years back, looking at how we can get near optimal behavior in approximate state abstractions. And here's the theorem stated informally, and I'll explain what this means step by step. And so what we're saying is, let's suppose that that I have some kind of state abstraction. What the state abstraction means is I'm going to take some states in my complex state space and combine them together. I'm going to aggregate them to say, hey, all these states all look roughly the same. I don't really have to think about the differences between these. I'm just going to combine them into one. What the theorem says is, if I aggregate in such a way that my Q function is similar between aggregate states, then my value function will also be similar. Or in kind of plain English, what I want to do is make sure that all of the kind of states that I aggregate together are similar from a decision-making perspective. That is, in any of the states, if I take kind of the same action that I aggregate together, then I'm going to get similar kind of discounted rewards. They're not off by more than epsilon. If I can guarantee this, then my optimal policy, pi star, and my abstracted policy, pi c, are within, say, O of epsilon of each other, off by some kind of some function of the discount factor. And so what this really tells us is, okay, if I want to take my abstracted state, if I want to get an abstracted state space, what I should do is combine together different states that have similar Q functions. Assuming I can find the optimal policy in the Q function, then I can aggregate my states together to find the kind of right abstract state or aggregated state space. And so you might ask, okay, this is a nice theorem, but why does this relate back to concept-based learning? And so the key idea is that we can think of concepts as state abstractions. So suppose I have this kind of complex state space where I have this kind of image representation. I have a bunch of different things that vary. But really what I'm dealing with at the end of the day is this simplified representation where I'm only looking at the concepts. And so what I want to do is I want to combine states that are similar, where similar is based on the kind of Q values from before, so that I select the concept so that only similar states are near together and different states are kind of separated away from each other. And so I'll explain what this means formally for an algorithm in a second, but this is the kind of key intuition that we have, is that we want to combine together the similar states through our concepts. In some sense, the concepts give us the lens in terms of, oh, these sort of kind of properties of states that matter. And so different states have to have different concepts is what we're saying implicitly when we select a certain subset of concepts. And so from there, we can develop an algorithm to say, how do we actually select which concepts are the most decision relevant? And so the key idea is that the decision relevant concepts are separating the states with different Q values. So for example, if I have two states that have very, very different Q values, which means that they have very, very different kind of actions you would take or decisions you would make or discounted reward, then I would want to make sure that my policy can distinguish them. That is, there's some concept that differs between the two. And so to kind of give this pictorially, you can imagine that the state on the left and the state on the right are very different because of the fact that on the state on the left, my optimal action is to turn left. On the state on the right, my optimal action is to go forward. And you can imagine that the discounted reward for different kind of state action or different actions heavily differ between the two states. What this implies is that when I'm selecting the concepts I should use for concept-based learning or for reinforcement learning, I want concepts that separate the two. And so naturally you might ask, okay, what are the sort of concepts that separate the two? And you could say different things. You could say, hey, for example, whether the door is open or closed is different between the two. This is maybe the reason I take a different action. Or whether I have the key or not differs between the two. Maybe that's why I take a different action. Or maybe the way I'm facing. For example, in the left one, I'm facing to the right. In the right one, I'm facing upward. Maybe that's what differs between the two. But I want to select one of these concepts, because if I don't select any of these concepts, then I can't really tell apart these states. And I'll take the same action in both states, which can lower my performance. On the flip side, you can imagine that states that are very similar. For example, you can imagine the state on the left and the state on the right. Both you take the same optimal action. Any action will result in the same sort of discounted performance. And if these two states are similar, then I don't really care about the concepts that differ between them. And so what the implication here is, okay, maybe the door color changes between these two states, but it doesn't seem like the door color actually impacts my performance. And so I don't see as much value in selecting the door color. And so you can repeat this for different pairs of states. And you can say, for example, in this case, I should probably select one of is the door open? Is the key, what row is the key on? Do I have the key and which way am I facing? One of those four kind of concepts seems at least somewhat important. And so if I do this for different state pairs, I get a sense for which pairs of concepts are most important. What this naturally leads to is an algorithm called decision relevant selection, which says, how do we select the actual concepts by representing this problem as an optimization problem? And so in this optimization problem, we'll have two variables. The first is xi, and we can imagine that I have, let's say, a huge concept bank of different concepts, and I want to select a subset of these concepts. And here I'll let xi be 1 if the concept I is selected. The second is y s and s prime. And what this variable says is, am I putting S and S prime in the same abstraction? Basically, am I aggregating these together? And the key idea is that if I'm going to aggregate these together, what that means is two things. One, that means that there's no concept that differs between the two, at least of the ones that I've selected. And two, I want to make sure that the states that I aggregate together, aka if y of S and S prime equals 1, that their sort of difference in Q values is quite small. And this is the kind of entire motivation for the algorithm. And so what this looks like is an optimization problem where I say, I want to minimize the kind of abstraction error, which relates to the guarantee from before, where I say, okay, I'm going to select a set of concepts so that for every single state pair, if they're in the same abstraction, then they have a small sort of difference in Q value. If I can do this, then I can get some guarantee from before where I can say, if I can minimize this and make this say epsilon, then the resulting policy I get training, the optimal policy I get at least, training on these concepts should perform pretty well. And then to define what Y and F, S and S prime is, we just say, okay, two kind of states are in the same abstraction if none of the concepts I select differ between them. In other words, if, for example, concept 5 is different between states S and S prime, that means they're in different state, kind of abstractions or different representations. And so then Y of S comma S prime is 1 or 0, but Y of S and S prime is only 1 if none of the concepts I select are different between the two pairs of states. And then the final thing is this kind of capacity or budget constraint, which basically says, okay, I'm going to select at most K of these concepts. And you can imagine that this comes from kind of practical constraints, where if I select too many concepts, then maybe my system is too complex, maybe it's not as interpretable. And so there's this kind of balance between I want enough concepts so that I can understand the state space, so that I can capture most of the kind of variation, but not too many so that my concept-based model becomes too complex, too hard to understand, things like that. And so a natural question is, okay, we have all of these state kind of pairs we're looking at. In a real environment, in many real environments, the number of state pairs is gigantic. And so when can this actually be kind of efficient? The kind of key intuition is that we don't actually need to go through every single state pair combination. We can sample these. And in practice, the kind of states we care about lie in maybe some kind of manifold, but a number of different concept combinations is not as big as you think it is. And as a result, the optimization problem actually stays small. And we'll return to this in a second. And so out of this, we want to see, okay, we have this kind of sense of an algorithm, and we have this problem. How well does this work? And we'll ask 3 questions related to how well this works in practice. The first is, how does this impact performance? If I select better concepts, does that lead to better kind of performance, better reward, things like that? The second is, how does this impact intervention? And I'll detail what intervention means in a second. But one of the nice things with these kind of concept-based models is that you can come in during evaluation or test time, change some of the incorrect responses, and result in higher performance. And we want to see, does better selected concepts have a positive impact on this? The third thing is looking at, is automatic concept selection similar to manual? And so we'll see, do humans select similar concepts to the kind of automatic algorithms? And this is a nice sanity check to make sure that when we know what humans select, that our algorithms can replicate this. And so what we'll do is we'll first look at the kind of experimental setup. And we'll look at 3 kinds of data sets. The first control data sets, we'll think about things like cart poll or other data sets like that, and all of these kind of data sets we're looking at are image-based. So for example, with cart poll, we'll look at an image-based version of that, which maps to certain control concepts, which then maps to the actual action. We'll also look at reinforcement learning data sets or environments. So for example, here we can look at Atari Pong and Atari Boxing. And finally, for the kind of more real-world element, we'll look at healthcare, where we'll say we have some kind of biological setting or biological kind of information on glucose monitoring, which will map to some kind of more human understandable concept, which then maps to a policy of, should I increase my insulin, should I decrease my insulin, things like that. And what we'll do is we'll look at this in 2 settings. The first is a perfect setting, where I'm going to get the ground truth concept information. And the second is an imperfect setting, where I'm actually learning my kind of concept predictors. And we want to see how kind of algorithms perform across these. To begin, I'll first talk about the actual speed of concept selection. And so what we'll find is that for all 4 of these algorithms, the actual time needed is roughly, it's under 10 minutes. And this is significant because for all these algorithms, training kind of good policies takes much, much longer. It takes on the order of hours or 5 to 10 hours or even more than that to train good algorithms or good policies potentially for some of these settings or environments. But the amount of time to actually select concepts is much, much smaller compared to that. And it grows pretty nicely. Like even if we double the number of concepts, the kind of time taken doesn't really increase by too much, which is a nice thing to have. And the real reason is that the effective state space is not too large, and we can just sample different state pairs and we can perform fairly well approximating in that way. The first thing we'll look at, the kind of first research question is, does the selection of decision relevant concepts improve performance? And so what I'll plot here is on the first row, I'll plot if we have perfect concept predictors. On the second row, I'll plot with imperfect concept predictors. And what I'll compare is a set of baselines, here random, variance, and greedy, against two algorithms. You can imagine the first is decision relevant selection, DRS, which is in this kind of grayish color, and the second is DRS log, which is in this sort of purplish color, which is just a variant of DRS that is kind of tailored towards the fact that not all concept predictors are perfect. What we find is in most of the environments that DRS performs best, and it can improve performance compared to these kind of baseline selections in kind of most of these algorithms, except for Pong, the perfect setting, where just because of the fact that there's a little bit of fine-grained issue with getting the exact right concepts there. And what you can find is that in some of the environments, for example, in Cartpool or Minigear, you can find a significant boost from selecting the right concepts. The next one we'll look at is test time intervention. And so I'll introduce what this means sort of briefly, and then explain what this how sort of decision relevant selection impacts this in practice. And so what test time intervention is it says, okay, I have some kind of human or some kind of oracle that can provide me ground truth concept labels at test time for some fraction example. And so you can imagine that, for example, in a setting where I want to predict sort of from MRIs or X-rays, whether what the KL grade is or whatever some kind of medical concept is, maybe a doctor comes in and they see the concept predictions and they say, hey, look, this concept prediction looks off to me. I'm going to go and intervene on this and change this, and then you can maybe get a correct prediction from that. One of the nice things we want to have is that as kind of people or doctors or humans or whatever oracle we have, go in and perform this test time intervention and change the kind of mistaken concepts, that our performance itself improves. That over time, if, for example, people correct, say 50% of the incorrect predictions, that our performance improves significantly and that it kind of monotonically improves over time. And so what we want to look at here is, hey, does the fact that we use decision relevant concepts improve the efficacy of test time intervention? The sort of intuition behind that is because I'm selecting more relevant concepts, each kind of intervention is more valuable because it will intervene on only the most important concepts. And so what we'll look at here is whether decision relevant concepts make intervention more important. And I'll focus on the first sort of block here, which looks at Cartpool, to explain what this plot looks like before moving on to everything else. And so here what we'll plot is the performance baseline without intervention, and then intervention on, say, 50% of the concepts. And so what we'll find is that performance, of course, improves, which is the reward at the y-axis, across these kind of different, or for most of these methods. What we find is that both for the baseline and for the intervention, using decision relevant concepts or the DRS algorithm leads to the best performance. And you can also see that it has a fairly steep slope where you can improve reward by a lot. And the reason it does this is that it doesn't necessarily select the most accurate concept predictors, which maybe other algorithms do, but it selects the most decision relevant ones. And you can see the same pattern across all these kind of data sets where we see that performing decision relevant selection leads to not only the best baseline performance, but the best intervention performance, because it makes sure that whoever or whatever is intervening on these concepts stays kind of relevant or intervenes on the most important concepts. The last thing we'll look at is the comparison with manual selection. And what we'll do is we'll look at the CUB data set. The nice thing with the CUB data set is that there are 312 concepts that are manually engineered. And we kind of, what naturally happens is these 312 concepts are manually engineered down to 112. And so with those 112, we can see like, oh, is the way that these concepts are manually engineered down to the 112 similar to the kind of predictions or concepts that are selected by our DRS algorithm? And so what we'll do is we'll compare the automatically selected 112 manual selections against the sort of the algorithms, what they predict for the 112 concepts. And so what we'll do is we'll see, okay, let's change the number of concepts to select kind of the K parameter and vary this between, say, like 25 and 112 and compare different algorithms. And what we'll find is that we can replicate the same performance of the DRS algorithm or of the manual selection using DRS and DRS log. And even we can use, say, like 80 concepts rather than 112, and we can get essentially all the performance back. And if we look at the similarity, what it does is it actually selects the same concepts that were manually selected. And so essentially what this gets at is a sanity check that, hey, the kind of things that humans select for, in this case, what they select for is some element of sparsity, some element of which kind of concepts have low variance or high variance, is the same kind of things that DRS selects for. And it's a nice sanity check to make sure that our algorithm makes sense. The kind of last thing that I'll conclude with is why this all matters. And so there's been some work recently out of Jessica Hallman's lab, among other people, looking at the impact of well-designed explanations. And the kind of key thing is that explanations can improve decision-making. And the way that these kind of explanations are presented, whether it's a line explanation, a counterfactual example, things like that, can have an impact in terms of the performance of humans. And so the kind of thing we want to get at here is to see, can we design explanations in such a way that they're decision relevant so that they can improve performance the most, not just kind of by itself, but also in kind of test time intervention or kind of in human AI collaboration and whatnot, and just kind of thinking about generally what is the best way, or what does it mean to structure explanations in the best way. And so some of the future questions we want to look at is to see along these lines, how could automatic concept selection actually be used in practice? How might people want to actually use this algorithm? How do humans actually perceive these sort of decision relevant concepts? Do they find these concepts more or less interpretable than, say, baselines? And what is the kind of perception of all this? And finally, how does decision relevancy apply to other sorts of explanations? Can we apply these kind of same ideas to other domains or other types of explanations and say, oh, we want to make sure that other sort of notions of explainability are also decision relevant? And so to conclude, what we looked at today is to see how do we select the most decision relevant concepts in concept-based models in this sort of decision-making setting. And so we started with the state space and said, okay, we have this model which maps this high-dimensional state space down to concepts, down to actions. And from there, what we can say is, okay, I want to select the concepts that are the most relevant for decision-making. What that means is I want to select the concepts that are most kind of relevant to distinguishing between different states where different is set in terms of the actions and Q values. And it doesn't really matter how I distinguish between similar states. Using this, we get an algorithm called DRS, and we find that this algorithm is both theoretically principled, where we can prove kind of performance guarantees on this, which is in the full paper. And also we can show that it does well in practice, where it can improve performance, test time intervention, and also aligns with sort of what humans would expect to select. Future work includes looking at how this actually does in practice, and we have a link to the QR code in the bottom right if you want to take a look at this. Thank you.
Amazing. Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, that was super interesting. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, go for it.
Thank you so much. I actually never saw anybody like look at this problem this way, so this is very interesting. So I had a question. So this works in pairs, right? Like you're trying to find the pairs of concepts, and you say these pairs are together, and so on. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
The main algorithm. So what if like something like only works in like three concepts be activated, or like three concepts are be activated? How are higher order interactions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I want to distinguish between so we're taking pairs of states here. And so what we really care about is the kind of difference in the Q values between pairs. Let me go back for a second, actually. So what really matters is the difference in Q values between different pairs of states. And so you can imagine that any kind of, if you have triplets of states,
they can have like multiple concepts. Like the two pairs can have many concepts.
Exactly, right. They can have many concepts can represent. So we can have like a list, like we can say we have 10 concepts. And so our question is basically, if these two pairs of states are different or similar, does one of my 10 concepts distinguish between them? And so what really matters here is the pairwise interactions, just because you can imagine that if I have like three-way interactions, I can, because of the fact that what I care about is the pairwise differences, I can break this down, any kind of number of interactions down to pairwise. And the main thing is that I want to make sure that whatever's in my kind of aggregate, whatever kind of maps to the same concept representation, has similar enough, for any pair, similar enough sets of Q values. And so that'll guarantee that everything is within epsilon of each other, or 2 epsilon of each other.
Okay, and when you select the two pairs of states, for example, in this classification problem for the CV, they are like basically the same class or different classes, and like that's how you compare.
Yeah, different. So they can be different classes. They can be any class in some sense. Like you want to select, you could imagine that, like in CV, for example, it's a bit special just because everything in the same class has the same concept representation. And so you could imagine that if you kind of formulate it this way, everything that has the same class, if S and S prime are the same type of bird, then your Q values will be the exact same. But if they're different kinds of birds, then they will be quite different. And so what you really want to do is select kind of a diverse set of pairs of states so you can get a sense for which pairs of states actually differ and which ones don't differ.
Okay, so then kind of like you need to be smart of how you select the pairs. Most important thing out.
Yeah, I think, yeah, to some degree.
Or do you just select like every like when you were doing this, did you just run on every single combination, or?
I think I think in most cases, running every single combination is almost infeasible. I think you should be, so I would say you should be somewhat smart. Like I think selecting a diverse set of states pairs is important. I don't think it matters a ton, just because if you sample enough, because of the fact that these are kind of bounded random variables, for example, you will end up getting enough information at some point, and you will roughly converge. But I think you need a decent number of samples, which is maybe one of the limitations. But also, you want to make sure that you sample kind of diverse pairs of states as well.
And when you were comparing with random, this is just randomly selected concepts, right? With the same number of randomly selected concepts.
Exactly. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Peter, go for it.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is somehow related to Aya's question. When you say aggregate states, it reminded me of prototype networks or instance space networks. I guess, like, I don't know whether you have tried using or like you see the similarity as well. Like, in a sense, if you want to aggregate two states, it means like there is something in common that is like shared by these two states, and you could capture it with a prototype, or like you can just use one of the two states as an instance that you as an anchor that you would use for like to represent this like the concept tuple activation that you produced, and then you just get rid of the other state, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not super familiar with like prototype networks, but I think your analogy definitely holds. And I guess you can imagine that in this setting we have like every single concept combination is maybe a prototype we're doing, and we're essentially just selecting like the base set of prototypes that can be combined into forming different prototypes. But I think the analogy definitely holds. I need to probably do some more reading on these kind of on instance-based or prototype networks to better understand these, but I think there's definitely some relationship there between the two.
Thanks. So actually, I have a question on the sampling side of things. So how do you go around that in terms of like, do you when you generate new states to generate the tuples? How do you generate the actual states that you sample from? Like, which policy do you follow a random like what is the data generating process there from your training set or from the environment that you're interacting?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I think we follow for the most part, we follow the optimal policy like pi star or like some baseline policy with some amount of like, we take some random actions every once in a while. You could think of almost like some UCB-ish version of like, or like some epsilon greedy version of pi star, just because the fact that if you only take pi star, then you will get maybe states that are only on the optimal trajectory. We want a little bit of divergence. So what we do is we basically do a bunch of rollouts with pi star with some amount of noise. And then you get a whole kind of host of states. And then I think from there, I believe we randomly sample pairs of states, removing duplicates and things like that. But I need to double check on how, I think that part I need to double check on.
Yeah, I'm the reason I'm asking is I'm curious, like, because imagine there's, which I guess is part of the thing, but you end up in this situation where you end up with sort of exactly like symmetrical states where you have a rotation of the other, which you expect them to map to the same exact concept space, which is what you want to find.
Yep.
But it's an inefficiency that probably it results in having to do one extra evaluation, right? When you already have that, you capture the essence of the state. But it's really difficult to capture those things unless if you randomly sample from a policy or from that. But more sort of generally speaking is that I'm also curious to like whether this could be done in sort of for supervised learning, for example, for just because kind of like the CUV style where you do concept selection there, because it's a general problem in terms of these unsupervised concept models where you have these very massive concept base like banks that come from, say, foundation models, and then you need to select a set of good concepts. Do you see a way, like how did you do this for the CUV? Did you just sample two images and then the action in this case would have been the class that you predicted?
Exactly right. I think that's how we did it for CUV. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I know I would figure this, a lot of the theory almost certainly like becomes much simpler once you do it in the supervised setting, just because you're not taking multiple steps. And so what I want to roughly say is you're doing some form of clustering essentially. If you're doing this in this supervised setting, you're essentially saying, hey, look, I have a bunch of labels and I have a bunch of hyperplanes that can divide, like each concept you can imagine, so a hyperplane that divides my space. Select a subset of hyperplanes that best divide my space up. And my guess is I'm pretty sure you can give much stronger guarantees than what we have in the unsupervised setting, or I'm sorry, in the reinforcement learning setting, with maybe some issues with like train test split. But if you can get over that, if you can assume that we can get over the generalization gap, you can almost certainly just take your data set, do some form, compute the concepts, and then you could there's probably a variant of this algorithm you can just run, basically saying, this is how I should split up, this are the kind of optimal concepts I should use given this data set. That should run fairly quickly just because it's a much simpler problem just because you're just finding the best hyperplane to split up the space.
Yeah, I agree. Like in my mind, it's sort of, I would expect it to behave similar to sort of feature selection, but on the concept level.
Exactly.
Right? Like you just finding the maximal discriminative set of, or the minimum discriminative set of concepts that sort of allows you to discriminate between classes. And this is sort of generalizing that into the RL set. We have to do this for actions as well, and then consider like the actual result at the end of the trajectory.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. But yeah, it would be cool evaluation in general because it means that it's the exact same idea can be applied very easily to things that problems that are sort of open in relatively not entirely solved well in supervised learning already.
Yeah, I agree with that. It would be helpful. Yeah.
Peter, see you have your hand up. Sorry, go for it.
It's a related question, but instead of looking at classification, I was still thinking about the reinforcement learning setting. Like going back to the example that you had on the key and the like finding the door and going in the next room. Yeah, this one. So if I understand correctly, like the environment is always the same, and here, so let's say in this 3x3 square environment, you are selecting just like a few concepts that are related to this specific environment. But let's say that you don't now open the door and you go in the next room, and the next room has a different environment. You need to, I guess, the concepts that you learned in the previous environment do not hold anymore, right? So you need to reselect from the concept bank again, right? Like the concepts that you selected in the previous environment may not fully capture the complexity of the new environment. Right?
Yeah, that's definitely true. This is something I think Stephanie mentioned to me as well, where it's like even in this mini grid, you could like this kind of mini grid environment, you could think of like different concepts only being unlocked at certain times. Like for example, only after you get the key will the door unlock, and so that concept becomes, it's hard to determine whether that's useful until you get like a decent enough policy. One thing you could think of is we just have like a giant bank of concepts that account for everything, which is maybe not the best way to do things, just because if you have a lot of different layers and levels and whatnot, it would be sort of inefficient. The other is maybe if you can divide this up into stages, you could say, what is I'm going to solve stage 1, find the concepts there, then solve stage 2, so on and so forth. But I guess this is a general like tricky thing. If you want to have like a simple but interpretable neural network where you need like, as you want to make it better and better, you need maybe some increasing complexity or increasing number of concepts, but this makes it harder to use. And there's kind of this inherent trade-off there. So it depends on the specifics. My guess is you can probably do something like what you just mentioned, but it depends on the problem specifics.
But I guess like the formulations would still hold. Like you can still dynamically update the selected concepts if you change the environment. Like
yeah, exactly. Or you can just imagine that's a gigantic environment where you just select a larger bank of concepts and it wouldn't change anything then.
Yeah. But if you divide it into stages, you said like you can have a smaller selection of concepts for each stage. Which
exactly, and you can just think of
things more tractable and easier to understand for each stage.
Exactly. You can just imagine kind of composing different environments on top of each other, and then you can just run concept selection independently for each environment.
Thanks.
Out of curiosity, how do you select the how do you construct a bank right now for say the Atari experience, for example?
Yeah, Atari. So I guess for all the environments we had, there was some prior work that actually did some of this that has done similar things. And so we used their bank. The way that they do it is, for example, with Atari, there's roughly the way it works is you have the actual Atari game, and underneath they have this sort of internal, let's say like the internal RAM. And the internal RAM stores like the game state. And from there, there's like a certain, like each game has its own thing, but there's only a certain subset of things that are actually like relevant. And so you can imagine like in Pong, all the internal concepts are just like, where's my ball? What color is my ball? Where's my pattern? Things like that. Whatever the game is actually storing. So we just we just kind of capture all of that. And that leads to, and we kind of discretize some of these too. And so this leads to like 200 and something concepts in Pong, which we reduce down to a much smaller number.
I see. Okay, and do you have a bit of a hunch as to what? Because Pong was the one that was a bit tricky, right? In terms of if I recall one of the results. Do you have a bit of a hunch as to why what's special about Pong? Is it just the fact that I guess you have to discretize a lot of the position? Maybe that's tricky, but I'm not sure if that's
That's my intuition as well. I think Pong is so like fine-grained in terms of like, you need to make sure you get your discretization down. Like that and card pull are both very tricky because if you don't discretize correctly, then it's much harder to kind of figure out like what to do just because it's very position dependent. So I think that's my suspicion, which also gets to the idea that I feel like if you have a better concept bank or one with more fine-grained concepts or whatnot, you can probably improve performance a little bit as well.
Yeah. No, but I just have maybe like if you want to have this sort of the idea of the abstract space, right, for things that are as continuous as Pong or Carpool, it's probably not the best setup where this will shine, just because it's there's not a clear abstraction that will encapsulate everything perfectly, right? You always have to sacrifice something.
I agree with that.
Yeah. Cool. Are there any other questions? No. Alrighty. Well, thank you so much, Naveen. This has been really interesting to hear. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, thanks so much for spending time with us and sharing this with us.
Really of course, yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. We are back next week as well. I think Maximilian is coming, if I'm correct. So yeah, please tune in, and yeah, I'll see you around.